People of the Ice Age. The most astonishing consequence of the acceptance that the hand axes of the Somme gravels were humanly produced artifacts, contemporary with the extinct animals with whose bones they were found, was the vast antiquity of humankind that this implied. Today we speak in millions rather than thousands of years from the earliest of our early ancestors. But already in the 1860s it was clear that one was indeed dealing with geological time, and with a period of very cold episodes, or glaciations, during what geologists today term the Pleistocene era, which began around 1.8 million years ago. This era ended around 12,000 years ago with the onset of a milder Holocene period, which has lasted down to modern times and seems set to continue for a while yet. The first home of Paleolithic archaeology was France. There in the north, in the river gravels of the Somme, in the quarries near Abbeville and Saint-Échelle, Boucher de Perthes had found the early stone tools that are now considered to belong to a lower Paleolithic phase. And in the middle of the 19th century, in the caves and rock shelters of the Pyrenees and the Dordogne, Édouard Lartet and Henry Christie conducted a series of excavations. They found deeply stratified deposits with abundant flints and with animal bones, all of which allowed the reconstruction of the diet of the hunter-gatherers of the Upper Paleolithic. It was possible to reconstruct a succession of phases based on the lithic industries. It was in the course of these excavations that the foundations for Paleolithic archaeology were laid, and some of the now standard research techniques developed. In a cave at the site of Aurignac, which later gave its name to the Aurignatian period, 18 human skeletons, contemporary with accompanying flint implements, were found by Lartet in 1860. And at the rock shelter of Cro-Magnon, in Les Aisies, deliberate burials were recognized, evidently of great antiquity. The fossilized remains of Cro-Magnon man are now recognized as belonging to the same species as ourselves, Homo sapiens, meaning man the wise. Finds such as these initiated the discipline of paleoanthropology, the study of ancient human remains. The find of fossilized human remains in a cave in the valley of the river Neander, the Neanderthal, near Düsseldorf in Germany, in particular received widespread attention. For the skull and skeletal remains differed from those found at Cro-Magnon. The bones are now recognized as belonging to a different species, to which the site has given its name, the Neanderthals. Prehistory took on a new dimension when it was realized that the Cro-Magnon humans and the Neanderthals were two different species, or subspecies, that had lived in Europe at the same time. The Neanderthal skull was shown to Darwin's colleague, Thomas Henry Huxley, who declared it the most ape-like skull he had ever beheld. So began the study of an episode in human evolution that continues to catch the imagination: the replacement in Europe of the Neanderthals by the new species Homo sapiens. It has been the starting point for many historical novels, from William Golding's The Inheritors to Jean Auel's Clan of the Cave Bear. The Neanderthal remains were indeed the first recorded find of a pre-sapiens fossil hominid, and opened the way to the study of the descent of man conducted on the basis of the fossil record. Recently, DNA analysis on bone from this very find has led to further interesting conclusions discussed in Chapter 5. Lartet and Christie also made the first discoveries of Paleolithic art. Small carvings of deer and other animals executed in bone and antler. Subsequently, small human figures in bone and stone were found not only in the Dordogne, but also in the open-air encampments of the mammoth hunters in what is now the Czech Republic. These finds introduced a new chapter in the history of art. But the most astonishing discovery, that of vividly painted animals of the Paleolithic period on the walls of caves in the Pyrenees and the Dordogne, seemed to many scholars too good to be true, and was not at once accepted. In 1879, a lively series of bison painted on the ceiling of the cave at Altamira, near Santander, in Spain, was recognized. But the freshness and vitality of the paintings, which remain deeply impressive today, aroused suspicion. It took more than 20 years before the authenticity of these and the other Paleolithic painted caves of France and Spain was accepted. Perhaps the finest of all these series of paintings is at Lascaux, near Les Aisies, a cave discovered by 4 schoolboys in 1940, and now sometimes, with justice, hailed as the Sistine Chapel of cave art. Such finds continue today. What is now recognized as one of the earliest of the painted caves, the Grotte Chauvet, was discovered in 1994. All these art finds were associated with flint industries of the Upper Paleolithic period, beginning with the Aurignacian, associated with the newly appeared species Homo sapiens. Before that appearance, in the Middle Paleolithic were found Mousterian industries, named after the rock shelter of Le Moustier near Les Aisies, associated with our predecessor, Homo neanderthalensis. The focus of Paleolithic research soon expanded beyond France and Germany. The British researcher Dorothy Garrod, who had begun her career with the excavation of Neanderthal remains in Gibraltar, in 1930 led a pioneering expedition to Palestine and to a remarkable series of discoveries at Mount Carmel, where she discovered early Homo sapiens remains and, remarkably, Neanderthal fossils also. This location was at that time the easternmost extent of the Neanderthal distribution. Her work opened up the possibility that the emergence of our species from its earlier ancestors might have taken place in Western Asia. She also excavated what appeared to be a pre-farming village of stone-built huts representing a new culture, the Natufian, which was to become important in later discussions of farming origins. Earlier hominid remains were also being discovered. In 1891, the Dutch physician Eugène Dubois, who had developed a fascination for human evolution, discovered in central Java, in Indonesia, the skullcap and later the thigh bone of what he considered an ape-like form, transitional between apes and humans. Named by him Pithecanthropus erectus, which means erect ape-man, it is today termed Homo erectus and considered to be about 1.5 million years old. At the time of the skullcap's discovery, no accurate estimate could be made of its date, but it was clearly an archaic form, much older, one could safely assume, than the finds from Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. Comparable finds were made in 1921 at Zhoukoudian, near Beijing in China, and at first were called Sinanthropus pekinensis, which means Chinese man of Peking. The hunt for early hominid fossils became worldwide, and it became clear that Homo erectus had lived in much of Asia as well as in Europe. But, as Charles Darwin had predicted, the earliest finds of fossil ancestors, or hominids, have come from Africa. Already in 1925, Raymond Dart discovered a fossil skull at Taung near Witwatersrand that he termed Australopithecus africanus, which means southern ape of Africa, and considered a possible much earlier ancestor for Homo erectus and the later hominids. And the splendid discoveries of Lewis and Mary Leakey at Aldoway Gorge in northern Tanzania, with a rich series of fossils and the oldest known tool industry, termed the Aldewan, began already in the 1930s. The fossil record was becoming sufficiently rich as to allow the outline of a family tree of descent for our species from the much earlier apes of the Tertiary period, the geological era preceding the Quaternary and the Pleistocene. In the space of just a few decades, what had seemed to some of Darwin's contemporaries as a wild and implausible surmise was being backed up by solid material evidence from 3 continents. There is no more persuasive example of prehistory in the making. Before the great civilizations. Some of the earliest successes of archaeology, as we have seen, took place well before 1859 among the ruins of the great civilizations of the classical world and the Near East. Explorations of these areas were now set up on a much more systematic basis. The great museums of the world, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Berlin museums, set out to acquire sculptures and other artifacts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. Many of the most powerful nations set up overseas schools or institutes in Rome, Athens, Baghdad, Cairo, and later in Ankara to further the studies of these great civilizations. New disciplines were created: Assyriology, Egyptology, Hittitology, to study the remains and the newly deciphered writings that the ensuing ambitious excavations revealed. The palace libraries of Nineveh, of Tel El Amarna in Egypt, of the Hittite capital of Boğazköy in Turkey, and later of Ebla in Syria, and indeed many others, added important chapters to early written history. Yet the same excavations offered rich documentations of still earlier periods, times when the texts were scanty or non-existent. In such cases, the definition of prehistory becomes rather fuzzy. Clearly, when Captain Cook first visited Australia in 1770, no earlier written texts were available. The prehistory of much of the Pacific extends down to the 18th century CE. In Scandinavia, literacy began with the Vikings. In the Americas, although there was indeed literacy among the Maya and the Mixtec of Mexico, the surviving texts are so few, after the severities of the Christian missionaries and the Inquisition, that the full light of history cannot be said to shine until the arrival of the conquistadors themselves. Some writers use the term proto-history for these periods when literacy was available but little used, or there is little surviving. This term might equally be applicable to Roman Britain, or to the early days of the literate civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. While accepting the possible validity of such distinctions, I prefer to include the early developments of the great civilizations within the scope of prehistory, since the general intention of such study is to grasp something of the processes and circumstances underlying the great transformations that form so important a part of the early human story. Any survey of early civilizations must include those of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus, as well as China, to which must be added those of Mexico and Peru. There are plenty of other candidates for inclusion in a systematic survey of early civilizations: Crete and Mycenae, the Hittites, Bactria, and early Iran, as well as Benin, Ife, and the towns of West Africa. But this is not such a survey. The discussion here will try only to suggest how studies made before 1939 enlarged our understanding of the nature of prehistory. Chapter 2. Mapping the Human Past. Prehistory before 1940. Although rather few people may have taken literally the proposed date of 4004 BCE for the creation, calculated from the Old Testament of the Bible, equally few had supposed that there was much that could be said about the human past prior to the writings of the Greek and Roman historians and the Old Testament narrative itself. The vast perspective that opened when archaeological time could be linked with geological time, based on the new science of geology, came as something of a revelation. So too did the suggestion, implicit already in Darwin's On the Origin of Species, that the human race was descended from earlier apes. In the controversy that followed, the Bishop of Oxford, Soapy Sam Wilberforce, turned to Darwin's protagonist, T.H. Huxley, and begged to know whether it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed descent from a monkey. Huxley, in reply, made the famous speech in which he said he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used great gifts to obscure the truth. Now that there was a human past to be investigated, discoveries came thick and fast. The three-age system could be applied to the whole of Europe and to much of the Old World. The great civilizations of the world were systematically investigated through excavation, findings now being considered worth study in their own right, not merely as illustrations of classical and biblical texts. Above all, the origins of humankind became a matter of intense interest. If the world, and with it the human species, had not come into existence a mere 6,000 years ago, what had human existence been like before that time? In this chapter, I would like to survey, rather briefly, some of the remarkable discoveries that were soon made in response to that question, in response to the revelation of 1859 that there was indeed a prehistory waiting to be written that preceded the existing narratives of written history. We shall see that, by the standards of today, the sort of prehistory that could be written before the Second World War had its limitations. It lacked the firm chronology that radiocarbon dating and other radiometric methods could provide following the development of atomic physics. Conclusions about prehistory sometimes rested on assumptions that we would today regard as racist. Prehistory's theoretical foundations were not very thoroughly developed. Yet in the burst of exploration during the 80 years that followed the revelation of a systematic archaeology, the revelation of the antiquity of man and of Darwinian evolution, a coherent picture of the origins of human society could begin to be established. Before the revelation of 1859. Already, well before the intellectual revolution that culminated in 1859, developments in archaeology in different parts of the world were bringing to light varied and interesting indications of preliterate and therefore prehistoric development. In northern Europe, as we have seen, burials were excavated, sometimes with very rich grave goods, which could be assigned to the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age on the basis of what was found. The highly impressive stone-built burial chambers, the megalithic tombs of northwestern Europe, of what was soon to be called the Neolithic period, such as Newgrange in Ireland, had been described by antiquaries, including Colt Hoare. They became an important focus for research, and great stone monuments such as Stonehenge and Avebury in England had already been well described by antiquaries, even if the monument's chronology was not yet well understood. Archaeology had also begun in earnest in Mesopotamia, as well as on the Nile, with the pioneering work of excavators such as Layard or the less scrupulous Giovanni Belzoni. Initially, the focus of interest was on the great civilizations of Assyria and Babylon and Egypt, rather than on the early phases, which attracted attention only later. The brilliant work of scholars such as Henry Rawlinson and Jean-François Champollion had, before 1859, led to the decipherment of the cuneiform and hieroglyphic scripts. In Mesoamerica, archaeology was revealing that before the time of the Aztecs, whom the Spanish conquistadors had encountered in Mexico in the early 16th century, great civilizations had flourished. Exploration of the Maya civilization, first popularized by John Stephens and by Frederick Catherwood, was well underway. Many of the sites were unknown to scholarship, lost in the jungle. Stephens's Incidents of Travels in Yucatan, published in 1843, became a bestseller, and Catherwood's illustrations of Maya monuments, great pyramids now revealed from the thick undergrowth, with their stelae inscribed in then undecipherable glyphs, were published in the following year. Naturally, this vanished civilization, now brought to public view, with its impressive sculptures and mysterious inscriptions, created an atmosphere of romance which it retains to this day. In North America, the impressive earth mounds of the Mississippi Valley were admirably documented in 1848 by Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis in their Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. Some were very big, extending for hundreds of yards, and the so-called effigy mounds were recognizably created in the form of animals, like the Great Serpent Mound of Ohio. Others were clearly settlement enclosures. The identity of the mound builders was another mystery. The obvious explanation today, that they were built by the ancestors of the American Indians of the contemporary present, was not at first accepted. With the new perspective offered by the concept of prehistory, research developed rapidly, producing a series of discoveries in every part of the world. Egypt. If we begin with Egypt, it is because of the contributions of Sir Flinders Petrie, not only the greatest of Egyptologists, but the scholar who initiated the systematic study of the formative time before the first pharaohs and the first pyramids, the pre-dynastic period. This is not the place to discuss the early exploration of the pyramids, the first and greatest of all the wonders of the world. But we can note that as early as 1859, through the efforts of Petrie's predecessor, Auguste Mayet, then director of the Egyptian Service of Antiquities, the first Egyptian museum was established. Petrie himself first worked in Egypt in 1881, the year of Mayet's death, excavating and promptly publishing about many predynastic sites and cemeteries, including Nakada and Koptos. In his publication of Diospolus Parva, he developed his seriation technique of sequence dating, the first quantitative approach in archaeology to questions of taxonomy and association. Naturally, when we think of Egyptology, we think first of the great monuments of Thebes and Karnak, of the Pharaoh Akhenaten city of Tel el-Amarna, and of the riches of the unplundered tomb of the Pharaoh Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. Those explorations were among the greatest triumphs of the time. But before those splendors of the Middle and New Kingdoms came the cities and the pyramids of the Old Kingdom and the early dynastic period. Before these, before 3050 BCE and the first pharaohs, was the period of advanced Neolithic culture, often called the pre-dynastic. Generations of scholars from Petrie onward have contributed to its study. Mesopotamia. Assyriology, like Egyptology, got off to an early start. The lead was taken in the early years of the 20th century by the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft, which means the German Oriental Society, with the excavations of Babylon and Ashur in Iraq, and then at Warka, where remains of a vast predynastic town were explored. As in Egypt, the term dynastic refers to the dynasties of kings recorded in the earliest written records. The earliest civilization in southern Mesopotamia, preceding those of Babylon and Assyria, is termed Sumerian. At Warka, formerly known as the city of Uruk in the land of Sumer, excavations revealed a succession of early temples and some of the earliest inscribed tablets known. The most spectacular finds of all were made not far away in the great cemetery of the later Sumerian city of Ur by Sir Leonard Woolley. There, in 1928, he discovered the royal tombs, undisturbed burials from around 2300 BCE, with treasures of gold and lapis lazuli and with remarkable evidence of funereal ritual, including the deaths of dozens of retainers accompanying their royal masters. The tomb's discovery caused a sensation comparable with that generated by Schliemann's researches at Mycenae, or those of Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter at the tomb of Tutankhamun. The complete publication of the excavation of the burials offers a record of one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of all time. At Warka, before the pre-dynastic remains of the Uruk period, a settlement had been found accompanied by pottery of the type known as Al-Ubaidware. Farther north, near Nineveh, at the site of Arpachia, the young Max Mallowan found pottery of what came to be called the Halafian culture, with a wide distribution in the northern part of the Fertile Crescent. All of this was important, taking the study back toward a time long before the urban civilizations of Mesopotamia and laying foundations for important work later in the 20th century. Mycenae and Crete. There was little inkling that Europe had been home to what might be called an early urban society or civilization until the dramatic discoveries at Mycenae in 1874 by the German businessman turned scholar Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann had already achieved fame through his excavations from 1870 at the site of Hissarlik in western Turkey. This was the first excavation of a tell, a settlement mound formed by successive occupations over several millennia, divided by Schliemann into 7 successive cities. His quest had been for the Troy of the Homeric epic. He found there a fortified citadel, and his discovery of a rich find of gold and silver vessels and bronze weapons in the citadel of the second city was claimed as the treasure of Priam, king of Troy in Homer's The Iliad. Schliemann later moved on to the citadel of Mycenae in southern Greece, legendary home of the Greek king Agamemnon. There, in a grave circle inside the Lion Gate, he found a series of Bronze Age shaft graves rich in weapons and in gold. These gave their name to the Bronze Age civilization that we now call Mycenaean, which flourished in the later second millennium BCE. Although the civilization was literate, an important archive of inscribed clay tablets was found by Carl Blegen at the Palace of Pylos, just before the outbreak of the Second World War. The tablets are palace accounts that offer no historical narrative. Sir Arthur Evans, son of Sir John Evans, who helped to establish the antiquity of man, began his excavations at Knossos in Crete in 1899. He discovered a large building which he called the Palace of Minos, the legendary ruler of Crete, and beneath it many yards of deposit going back before the palace to the early Bronze Age, and then below several further yards of Neolithic deposits. His sequence of Neolithic and then what he termed early, middle, and late Minoan periods provided the framework for later studies of Aegean prehistory. Successive generations of scholars have excavated other Minoan palatial centres, peak sanctuaries, and tombs, and the decipherment in 1953 by Michael Ventris of the Linear B script that Evans discovered at Knossos placed the Minoan as well as the Mycenaean civilizations in the literate world, even if the contents of the tablets offer few historical insights and certainly no king lists. The Indus. The discovery of the urban civilization of the Indus Valley came much later than those of Mesopotamia or the Nile. The Indus, mainly in what is now Pakistan, was the home to an ancient urban civilization that we now know to have been contemporary with Sumer and with Old and Middle Kingdom Egypt, and which came to a rather mysterious end around 1800 BCE. It had declined before the beginning of the Egyptian New Kingdom or the rise of Mycenae. At Harappa, which has given its name to the accompanying culture, Harappan, D.R. Sani and then M.S. Vats excavated parts of a large brick-built city whose prosperity, like that of Sumer, was based on the fertility of the river's floodplain. 400 miles to the southwest lies Mohenjo-Daro, first excavated by Vats and by K.N. Dixit, and then by Sir John Marshall, and published by him in 1931. There are several central buildings, including what appears to be a granary and an impressively large bath or pool. The civilization is unusual in lacking any clear religious iconography. No system of shrines, or indeed of palaces, has been found. Its pictographic script, which went out of use by 1800 BCE, has not been successfully deciphered, despite several brave attempts.
This ends Disc 1.